start and then. All right, we're all set.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining. This is the second seminar in this year's installment of the Water Program Team monthly water seminar series. We're delighted today to have Paolo D'Odoricois from UC Berkeley. He's a professor of ecohydrology in the Department of Environmental Environmental Science, Policy and Management, sorry. So thank you so much, Paolo. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, or to be to have the opportunity to give a seminar. And Safik and Ellen asked me to give a talk on focusing on a recent paper we had on value of water in agriculture. I added a few things that are connected and we can serve either as an introduction or as a corollary to the study. And also, I need to clarify that I'm not an economist, I'm a hydrologist. So if I use some terms that are not correct or perhaps not the exact terms from the point of view of the economist, please allow for some forgiveness. And with this, I'm going to stress the fact that the focus here is on water in agriculture, and the focus on agriculture is mainly because most of the water we use is for agriculture and is mainly used for food production, and therefore we have a particular interest in looking at water in agriculture. I'm trying to get rid, I'm sorry, but I have so many windows open on top of my presentation that I cannot even see. Okay. I think we are good. And so the water used in agriculture is of two types. Is either water coming from directly as precipitation on cultivated land, and this is what is defined usually the rain-fed part of agricultural production. And then in regions of the world where this which rain-fed agriculture has some water stress, we can increase production by adding irrigation. And the first case, the rain-fed agriculture, uses what has been termed sometimes also as green water. This is a jargon that has been introduced about 15-20 years ago, but it's mainly rainwater. And irrigation water is usually called also blue water, and it comes from river streams on groundwater. It's pumped and or transported with canals and applied on agricultural land. So irrigated agriculture uses both blue and green water. If we look at the water use for agriculture, we did an estimate and other groups did the same. Is this big number, is 1210 to the 12 cubic meters per year. And to have an idea of how big it is, I compare with the fluxes in the water cycle. This is about 10% of precipitation over land and 16% of terrestrial evapotranspiration from all ecosystems. And so this 10% of this water is applied through irrigation. And these are the different types of forms of water consumption in agriculture, mainly for crops, for food and fiber, but also for feed and livestock production. They claim a big fraction of the total water consumption in agriculture. And if we compare with other sectors, we often hear about the water used for energy production. If we look at consumption, and consumption here means the amount of water that a certain activity transforms from the liquid phase into the water vapor and is released to the atmosphere. And so we need to wait for the water cycle to provide again that water in the form of precipitation in order to be available for human uses. And so we see that consumption, in terms of consumption, energy production is just a very small fraction of the water use for irrigation. And so irrigated areas, there have been some studies trying to map the irrigated areas around the world. And our group has done an analysis of sustainability. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because in this talk, we will hear many times, you will hear me many times talk about sustainable irrigation. So here for sustainable irrigation, I mean a form of irrigation that doesn't deplete environmental flows. So using all the water from the Colorado River, leaving the river dry, is unsustainable in the sense that it destroys aquatic habitat and has a huge environmental cost. At the same time, irrigating by using groundwater and depleting groundwater stocks is by definition non-sustainable, because that water will not be available to the next generations. So we refer to sustainable irrigation as that irrigation that doesn't deplete environmental flows or groundwater stocks. And if we do this analysis and we calculate the irrigation water consumption, we say that it's unsustainable irrigation if the irrigation water consumption exceeds the local water availability, where the availability is given by runoff, which comprises both surface and groundwater runoff, minus the environmental flows, because those are not considered as available for water, for human uses. So with this framework, we did the global analysis with the global crop water models and global hydrological models to determine the water that is locally available. We did it on a grid that is 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. We did similar studies also 10 by 10. And just this is sufficient to identify areas that where the amount of water that we use for irrigation exceeds the local availability. And this would be the purple areas in this figure. And since we are in California, I also did this enlargement for this part of California. And so in the world, 40% of the irrigation is unsustainable because, again, it causes the loss of environmental flows or groundwater stock. Try to put some names on areas that are known for being affected by groundwater depletion, either in form of environmental flows or stocks. And these are some areas that are affected by this unsustainable use. The other thing that is important, since we are looking at a global scale, is the importance of water for food security. So while dealing with most of the current literature on feeding the world type of literature, the approach to feed the world in the next 50 or 100 years are based on two different pathways. And of course, most likely one would be a mix of the two. We can either intensify agriculture on the existing agricultural cultivated land, or we can expand agriculture at the expenses of other ecosystems, could be savannas or forests. So ecologists tend to advocate often for intensification, because it prevents additional habitat destruction and associated carbon losses. And so if we do this, then there have been studies quantifying the yield gap. And then also our group did an analysis of how many people you can feed by closing the yield gap. And this analysis doesn't take account for the fact that in many cases there isn't enough water to close the yield gap. So the yield gap is the gap between current yields and maximum potential yields. And with different scenarios, we can determine how many people, and we can find that about 4 billion people can be fed by closing this gap. But to close this gap, many times we need to add not only fertilizers, but also bring irrigation. And in many regions of the world, there isn't enough water to close the gap. So we did this analysis, expanding now irrigation. Before we did it on the current irrigated land. Now we look at the areas that can be irrigated potentially in a sustainable way. And so the green areas are the areas where the irrigation water requirements can be met with the local water resources in a sustainable way, again, without depleting groundwater stocks or environmental flows. The yellow areas are areas in which instead the closure of the yield gap would be unsustainable. This shows that when we do this analysis and we calculate the number of people we can feed, we could go from 4 billion people to 2.8 billion. And then if we want to remove areas that are currently irrigated in an unsustainable way, so the purple areas in this figure, we go down to 1.8 billion people. So there are serious constraints placed by water resources and available for irrigation to the ability to meet the growing demand for food commodities. And of course, this is I just marginally touch this topic. Of course, there is a rich literature showing that the new pathways to food security should focus on reduction of consumption of waste, changes in diets, etc. So we don't need to get into that. This is just to show that the expansion of irrigation is possible only in 26% of the areas that are currently rain-fed. And so now this is the introduction and the context of why we are interested in irrigation. And the main focus of this talk is on determining the value of water for irrigation. And water is seldom treated as a commodity and traded in a marketplace. And it remains many times underpriced, and there is some literature showing, stressing that farmers don't pay for its real value. And sometimes they don't even pay for the provision cost, the cost not only of water as a resource, but of extracting and delivering this water. So we have that the crops require a huge amount of water, but the water costs don't play or the water is, this water is not factored many times in the cost of agriculture. And this, of course, there are some exceptions, and California most likely is one of them, because in most of the world, water is not treated as a commodity because there are no tradable water rights, and so this and there isn't a mechanism to establish a market and to have a price for water. So in the question of what is the value of water, of course, if there is a water market, probably it's easier to find the answer to this. The focus here is on the regions of the world in which, because of lack of tradable property rights, there isn't a water market, and so there isn't a price on water as a resource or even as a commodity. And so this is because in many cases, either the water rights are tied to the land rights, and so it cannot be traded separately, or in other cases, we are in a situation in which water is treated as a public good or an open access resource, or even as a common pool resource. In those cases, there isn't a water market, there isn't the possibility to establish a water market, and there isn't a way to determine directly through a market price the value of water. So in the absence of tradable water rights, the water remains non-commodified, and we can still try to determine its value by looking, and which is what we are doing today, by looking at the value that can be generated by water in agriculture. And of course, there is a rich literature on this, and different approaches. I'm not an expert in econometrics, and also, but in general, the literature tends to use methods that are hardly applicable to the entire world, which is what we are trying to do today. Also, when we talk about value of a natural resource, we can look at the direct use value. So the direct benefit that we get by using, in this case, water. So this is the use value. Or there is an indirect use value, or the non-use value, the value the benefit we have from leaving that resource untapped. And then there are, and these two values are based, are strongly anthropocentric. So our values with respect to humans and human uses. Instead, there is also an intrinsic value on, which is based on of a natural resource that is independent of its use by humankind. This is interesting because, at least in the environmental science literature, there is a lot of interest in this more ecocentric view of natural resources, and in recognizing their value independently of their direct or indirect use by human societies. which is something that my understanding is very hard to it's very hard to quantify, but remains it's very hard to quantify, but and it's been also valued by many indigenous groups around the world, and recently led to the formulation of this notion of the rights of nature, or in their form of the rights of water, considering basically nature as an entity that has its own rights. But without going to that, now we are going to focus on direct use value. And this focus is on agriculture. And we are going to look at how water is one of the factors of production in the same way as labor and capital are. And then I know that economists or a branch of economics tends to look at the production functions, in which the production rate is a function of these factors of production. This production function here is represented by this FC, which is the production function for the commodity or the crop C. And then if we take the first order derivative with respect to water, we obtain and multiply by the price of the commodity, we obtain a way to determine the value generated by a unit amount of water. The problem with this approach is that we typically don't know this function FC. Instead, in the case of agriculture, what we are proposing now is that we can use a more simplified approach. And it's based on the realization that the total yield of a certain crop C is the sum of two terms. There is a rain-fed yield, what we would get without irrigation, and then there is an increase in yield, that is delta Y, which is resulting from irrigation. So because of irrigation, there is yields grow from YR to YC. And so the value of irrigation water can be expressed as the ratio between the net value generated by irrigation divided by the irrigation water application. And so we will not try to determine a production function in these classical terms, but we will look just at differences in yield between irrigated and rain-fed. Now, I should have acknowledged since the beginning that this is the result of work we have done with a group of people, including, and this framework was then formalized in discussions with David Zilberman, and while the model simulations were done by my colleague Maria Cristina Rulli in Milan. And so we see that if we want to determine the net value generated by irrigation, we can account for different factors. First, there is the increase in production and the time, so the increase in yield times the price of the crop, divided the amount of water. This gives us the value of generated by a unit amount of irrigation water. So IWR is the irrigation water requirement. But then we said there needs to be a net value. So we need to subtract all costs. And so we can look at different types of costs. One of them is all the incremental production costs associated with the irrigation. See, because the point is this, in the production of a certain crop, by adding irrigation, we don't add all the costs, but only some of them. The costs are related to the maintenance and the investments in irrigation infrastructure, but the land, seeds, machineries, etc., are the same in the case of rain-fed and irrigated production. So we need to add only the costs that are directly associated with irrigation. Of course, there are some costs associated with the fact that we might need more fertilizers because of leaching induced by irrigation, but we neglect that. And so these are the additional costs are mostly the maintenance and the operation of irrigation systems. In addition, there is an incremental cost for provision, pumping, piping, and making investments in these infrastructures. Then there are environmental costs. These are environmental externalities, like loss of environmental services associated with irrigation. And finally, there is the future cost, the fact that the value that this water could have generated in the future if it stayed in storage. So at this point, we need to make some simplification because, of course, we cannot evaluate all these terms. We start with the fact that this incremental cost of production, if we neglect the fact that, because of the fact that many costs are the same in the case of rain-fed and irrigated production, as I said, the land machineries, even most of the labor and seeds, etc., we can neglect this term. Then we have the additional, the effect of environmental externalities. And this is the reason why we started with this by discussing and introducing the notion of sustainable irrigation. So here the focus is only on the expansion of the irrigation in areas in which it can be done sustainably, or the evaluation of water in areas where irrigation is sustainable. Sustainable means that there are no depletion of environmental flows or groundwater stocks. There are other environmental externalities. If we irrigate with saline water, again, we assume that there are basically that this is the ideal situation in which the externalities have been reduced and are negligible. Then there are the future costs, but then again, since we are saying that we are not depleting groundwater stocks, even these future costs are negligible. And finally, the most difficult part is really the cost of pumping, piping, the investments in infrastructure, its maintenance. For now, please allow me to even neglect this term, and then we will go back and try to verify how big or small it is. So if we do this, we are down to, and this is the paper in which we present this work. We are down to a very simple expression to determine the value of water in irrigation, in agriculture. So it depends clearly on the crop price, which is, and this is the price of the crops at the farm gate. Then it's the irrigation water requirement per unit land area. We calculate that through classic crop water models. These models are basically require input of data and parameters that are representative of climate, soils, and crop type, and also the efficiency of the irrigation system. These models are basically calculate evapotranspiration coupled with the soil-water balance to determine the amount of water that is used by the plants in conditions of rain-fed production, and additional water the plants could use in the form of irrigation. And so this allows us to calculate the irrigation water requirements. And we have done this analysis. When I was preparing this talk, I decided to spare you the details, but basically we can run this type of analysis on a global scale because we have access to global data sets that allow us to make this analysis. Then we have the incremental change in output. So this requires, again, the use of data that allow us to determine the change in production between rain-fed and irrigated conditions. There are some well-tested relationships. Some of them, and the most classic one that I'm showing here is due to Dorenbos and Kassam, is based on the assumption that crop yields scales linearly with the crop water stress, in the sense that as crop water stress goes to zero, the crop yield increases up to its maximum value. So in this equation, ETA is the actual evapotranspiration, PT is the potential evapotranspiration in conditions of no water stress. KY is instead is a crop yield response factor, and in the literature we find all these parameters for most of the crops. So we can apply this method worldwide because it was already a common practice to estimate the irrigation water requirements on a global scale, etc. Here we are just adding the analysis of the value of water. So what is the value generated by irrigation in agriculture? And so to run it on a global scale, we just use global data sets for climate parameters. We use a this harmonized world soil database, because we need to have soil parameters to determine the soil-water balance. We also use parameters from crops and irrigated areas from Siebert and Dole, and also the global assessment of irrigation systems, since part of this analysis relies on water withdrawals. We need to determine what is the efficiency of the irrigation system, and we use some crop-specific data. And then we consider, for now, we just consider 16 crops that cover 70% of global food production. What we obtain with this method are these estimates of water value, and we obtain the global maps, and I will show some of them. But then to present the data now, I put them, we group them in different regions of the world, and you see that there is a strong variability. In fact, there is a stronger variability in water value across crops than across regions. And for the 16 major, for the main staple crops that are shown in these figures, the value of water ranges from 5 cents per cubic meter to 16 in the case of wheat, to 16 in the case of rice and maize. And for the 16 major crops, then we add other crops that are not only staple crops, are of higher value. The value of water increases because it can generate, again, higher value. And these are global maps. Of course, there are differences, regional differences, because also the yields, so the production per unit area, change dramatically across regions of the world because of different climates and soil fertility. And then we can look, this is done for specific staple crops. If we take for every pixel, 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers or 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers, there isn't only one crop, there is a mixture of crops. So if we take the crops that are currently cultivated in those areas, we can determine the current, with the current crop distribution, the value of irrigation water. And again, this gives us an idea of how it changes from in different regions of the world. We can do also an analysis in time. It just requires analyzing, changing from year to year, the climate parameters and also the price. And then we can really see that price plays an important role. There are 2 spikes in some of these regions, which correspond to the food, spikes in food prices in 2008 and 2011 in the 2 recent food crises. And so now I think it's interesting to compare the prices with what happens in water markets. Globally, we find a median value of 13 cents per cubic meter. Now we can compare with some water markets around the world. I took some data from this case of Colorado. They were reporting between 2 and 8 cents per cubic meter. But then in conditions of competition with other industries, the price would increase to 80 or even more than $1 per cubic meter, because of the well-known fact that the oil industry has a much higher economic efficiency in use of water resources, in the sense that it can generate higher revenues with the same amount of water than with respect to agriculture. And so at some point, farmers, when they reach a certain value, can just give up irrigation water, and because the value generated in agriculture is around that 13, globally would be around that 13 cents per cubic meter. This is the case of Permian Basin in Texas. They created a system with an app where also other industries can buy water from farmers, and it's 5 cents per cubic meter, and goes up to 2.5 again in the case of competition with the shale oil industry. So basically, farmers sell their water rights if the price exceeds the value generated in agriculture, which is what we tried at the global scale to do in this analysis. And then we did, in the case of the Murray and Darling Basin, many of you are more familiar than me with the water markets, but they have a remarkably well-organized platform where we can get a lot of information. So the median price and this long-term period fluctuated between 5 and 50 cents per cubic meter, and our results show for the same region, for the same basin, 21 cents per cubic meter. So at least we capture the this method is consistent with what we see in the water markets. Then I promise you that we needed to go back to the provision cost, because of course the irrigation system have their own costs, otherwise we would have irrigated the entire planet. And so there are some costs. We use the database from Australia, because the Australia Bureau of Statistics reports a bunch of different things, not only the water area, but also the amount of volume withdrawn for irrigation. They analyze the cost of equipment that we can analyze, and the cost of operation, the cost of irrigation overall. So we calculated then this value would be in the last column, and it is between 1 and 2 cents per cubic meter, while on average in Australia it's around 27 cents per cubic meter. So to some extent we can say, okay, at least is not, in the case of some crops, of course, the two numbers, so the provision cost and the value of water we estimate might be much closer. But on the average, we can consider this as assumption that the provision costs are negligible as acceptable. And so you might wonder what is new in this method, because there are entire books on the evaluation of water and on water value. Well, first of all, I think the merit of the study is mainly that we provide a global distribution of water value, even in areas where there are no water markets, where there are no water transactions, where there is also limited access to more detailed data. And we are the main assumption is that we estimate the water value based on the volume that irrigation water generates, value that irrigation water generates in agriculture, and then the spatial distribution. Spatial distribution, we can the main limit is just the resolution of crop maps, and so here we used 10 kilometers, but we can also go to higher resolutions once we have access to better crop maps, perhaps future improvements in remote sensing, or and in a way that we can have information on the crop distribution around the world. The temporary resolution is not very high, because we need, because of the nature of this approach is one growing season, or 1 year, most likely one growing season, because we need to, is all calculated on the amount on the price at which crop after it's harvested is sold, and on the integrated cost, water cost of the production in the course of the growing season. And water in terms cost in terms with reference to blue water, to irrigation water. So possible applications, we can determine, for example, the value to farmers of water entitlements, or the value of some long-term water permits and concessions. And this, in a world where water entitlements can be traded, if not now everywhere, but it could be traded in the future, this can be an important factor. Then the other thing is we can determine also the value that agricultural land acquires, or an increase in value in agricultural land that is contributed by gaining access to a source for irrigation water. And again, I'm not an economist. I think it's just discounting for the future the value of water. And then we can determine this per unit volume, or also multiply by the actual volume of this of the water that is annually on a certain year available for irrigation. These results can also be useful for land and water investors, so they will know what is the value they can gain by gaining access or negotiating the acquisition of right to have access to water resources. And the same thing could also be true in the case of those who have now some water rights and are negotiating their sale. So for my part of my research, I've been in the last few years, we have been investigating this phenomenon of large-scale land acquisition and the associated acquisition of water resources. And water often, as I said before, is a common pool resource that is often targeted by investors to convert that into something that is commodifiable and acquired. And because of, and many times, even rural communities in the developing world could benefit from having an evaluation of the value of the water resources they're about to give up through even a temporary permit or a license. And so I'm saying this because otherwise it could be seen that this exercise of evaluating water resources, determining the value of water resources in parts of the world where water is not commodified, can be seen as an attempt to put a price tag on nature with the goal of commodifying nature to the benefit of agribusinesses, while there could be also benefits to rural communities who are targeted by these investors. And then there is the possibility to have a quick assessment of the opportunity to invest in irrigation infrastructure, and to what extent this infrastructure would be profitable. There is also a process of financialization of water, and in 2018 there was the development of this NASDAQ Veles California Water Index. I'm sure that many of you know more about it than me, but it's basically based on the value of water or the price of water in the California water, in 4 California's water markets. And they picked those water markets because nobody knows what is the value of water in other parts of the world. And so they, but there could be some interest in creating also financial instruments that rely on, are based on the value of water in areas where there isn't a water market. I want to check that I don't want to go over my time, but I wanted to mention a couple of other things very quickly. We often talk about water scarcity, and I already gave the definition earlier in this talk of green and blue water. Green water is rainwater and blue water is irrigation water. So usually in conditions of green water scarcity, there can be an interest in developing irrigation. And at that point, if there is a green water scarcity, the next question could be if there is blue water scarcity or not. In case there is a blue water scarcity, we might wonder if basically there is the need to, if there is no blue water scarcity, we can develop irrigation infrastructure. In this case, we can might wonder if there is already irrigation infrastructure. And in case there isn't, this condition has been defined sometimes as economic water scarcity, in the sense that there is the need for irrigation, there is enough blue water for irrigation, but there isn't infrastructure. And so we did an analysis in the agricultural land around the world. We said part of it is currently irrigated, 23%, and 77% is rain-fed. Of this rain-fed area, a part has some green water scarcity, so it would benefit from the development of infrastructure. And in some of these areas, there is blue water scarcity, so there is no way to develop infrastructure, but there is some other areas where there is the opportunity to expand irrigation. And so I thought it could have been interesting for this audience to look at this quantification. We identify regions of the world where there is economic water scarcity, so where there is enough where irrigation can be expanded, but currently there is no infrastructure. And then if we also account for the effect of deficit irrigation, So the fact that we, in areas where there isn't enough water to meet the irrigation water requirement, we can still meet part of the requirement in conditions of deficit. And we can, which would mean expanding some irrigation also to these yellow areas, but without meeting the requirement. We can determine, I'm going to skip this figure because it's very long, we can determine areas where there is the strongest potential for developing irrigation. And this includes the Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. There are regions where there is the opportunity to, particularly in Africa, would be close to the equator, where there is enough water to expand irrigation to rain-fed areas. So these areas could be really targeted by land and also by water investors. And with this, I'm ready for some conclusions. I'm always worrying of running out of time. But the conclusions are mainly that the focus of this talk has been on sustainable irrigation. So irrigation that doesn't induce any depletion of groundwater stocks or environmental flows. So in a way that we can rule out all those conditions in which irrigation leads to some substantial environmental externalities or future or losses of future uses. And we determined a way to proposed a way to calculate the value of water in agriculture based on the increase in crop production and with respect to rain-fed conditions. And then we determined the global water of agriculture that in areas where there aren't tradable water rights, there aren't water markets, so there isn't a known price for water resources. And so this, again, can be of some use for both investors in water or in general agricultural assets, or but also for rural communities. And then by mapping these areas that are suitable for potential and sustainable irrigation expansion, we see where the stronger potential for also agribusinesses to look for investments in tight water entitlements or in water resources in general are more likely to, or could happen with at least there is the strongest potential to expand irrigation in areas that are suitable for agriculture. And with this, I'm done, and I'm ready for some questions.
Great, thank you so much, Paolo. We have a handful of questions in the chat, and I'll just go through in the order that they came in. The first one is sort of from back in the beginning of your talk when you were introducing this idea of irrigation sustainability. And the question is, isn't your definition subjective?
Of course, in the sense that it can be subjective because we adopted this definition. I know there is a rich literature on sustainability and natural resources. This seems to meet some of the general idea that it's based on a strong notion of sustainability, in the sense that it doesn't deplete natural capital. And I think that was the main reason why we adopted that one. I feel, if I had to criticize our own definition, is that there is, we could have, and we should find a way to account for the environmental damage caused by lack of adequate water quality. And also, the other thing is that the environmental flows need to be, the definition by itself talks about environmental flows, but there is a very subjective part also in the definition of environmental flows or criteria to determine environmental flows. But perhaps, I don't know how to pull out the chart, but if the question has a better idea of alternative definitions, perhaps that would be, could be interesting to talk about it.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what is your data source? But I believe that was asked when you were first introducing the paper, and perhaps that one was answered later on in your talk. So please follow up with an additional question if that one hadn't been answered through the talk. From the same person, we have a follow-up question. What do you mean the price of products do not account for water consumption?
I meant with that if water is not paid for, of course there are it doesn't account for the because water is paid for in the sense there are other costs associated with the extraction of the resource, the delivery of the resource, but the resource itself, if it's not paid for, again, in a world without water market or without any payment for a concession for water resources, it would not be accounted for. And again, I'm not an economist, so if you have a more sophisticated way of expressing this, I would be happy to, yeah, to learn about it.
Another question here harkens back to when you were first introducing the equation for estimating the value of water in agriculture that had several different components that essentially had to be assumed away in the analysis. I think that's when the question came in, and the question is, how is delta EC quantified? Yeah, for example, to use a well-known example from California, how much is a delta smelt worth?
Delta EC here. So here we assume that delta EC is 0 because we assume that there are no environmental externalities. If there were environmental externalities, and this is the old exercise of environmental economics to determine the value of ecosystem services in a way that would be possible to quantify the value of this loss of ecosystem services. Here we went not in a very unsophisticated way. We neglected this because again the goal was for this arguably and or questionably definition of sustainable irrigation in a way that this term could have been neglected. And again, the goal was to have this broad brush picture for the entire world.
Great. I also wanted to ask a question about, I mean, sort of going back to sort of how you were saying, like the sort of the main contribution of this type of analysis is that we get this global look, right? And then you highlighted a number of like very relevant applications of the use of the value of water in agriculture. But like I was struggling, to me, a lot of those applications could derive from, you know, a regional study, for example, that maybe uses other more traditional economic methods to estimate the shadow value of water. And so I'm curious if you could sort of share some of your takeaways from this analysis, specifically in regards to the spatial or temporal distribution of the value of water in agriculture across the globe. Sort of if that's one of the main contributions, is that you get this global look both spatially and temporally. What do we learn from comparisons across the globe?
This is a good question. Perhaps the interesting thing would be that you can, first of all, you have a world map and you can move your mouse on a certain location and know already what is the value of water there. And so suppose that you are, I'm giving some examples of things that we have been doing. If we look at the places where agribusiness investors can go and invest in, again, agricultural resources, can be land and water, that could give them a sense. Of course, there are many other political and institutional factors that drive those investments, but of areas where there is more potential because there are more, if we combine these parts of the talk, more untapped resources, and where these resources would generate higher value. The other thing would be, in a similar way, when we look at the development of some major infrastructure. I have a student who is now studying the construction of dams in Africa, and you can identify with remote sensing the new irrigated areas that are emerging there. And you can look at the increase in value that in the region is possible because of the construction of the dam and the irrigation of these regions. So probably it's more that to have this large scale perspective, more because I agree with you that otherwise the more traditional shadow price evaluations would get probably, or without probably, a more accurate result or more defensible result at the smaller scale. I think there is also some value. I don't know, again, when we hear, I was reading somewhere in the news, what is the value, the global value of the agricultural real estate and in the world, and a certain number of $1 trillion, of course, but perhaps it's possible to do the same also for water resources. I don't know for what purpose directly, but there could be some interest in having a better, even just a better appreciation of the value of water in the system of production in agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Would you mind also reminding me where your price data came from? And because I was thinking, you know, oftentimes that data gets estimated, and would there be any concerns that, you know, different countries estimate it differently, and that might lead to, you know, a different interpretation of the results of the value based off of that? So
we use the FAO database. It's called FAOstat, mm-hmm. and they give values at the farm gate, which I think is the right value in this case because it is really what goes into the pocket of farmers. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know to what extent they've been able to create some uniformity and homogeneity mm-hmm. within this database. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, sorry. I was just going to ask if there one last call sort of for any other questions in the chat. But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Paolo. Please no. I was going to say that if anyone on the call have some ideas, suggestions, or feedbacks, that is always welcome, and perhaps can lead to more thoughts. Also, could be, given the nature of this group, it could be nice to have an idea of how this could be of any use for California or for our region in general. Great. Well, thank you so much for presenting. I mean, one of the reasons I really wanted you to come and present this paper was because I feel like this paper kind of embodies the water program team and ANR in its sort of interdisciplinary approach to this question. And so anyways, really appreciate you sharing the details with all of us. My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. All right, we'll be back in 1 month. Everyone, look out for announcements to come for the next presentation. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.